do now is I want to introduce to you Matt Lynch. He's the Director of Office of Sustainability for the entire UH system. And he'll explain to you through the video that we're going to show you and through his talk with you exactly what he does.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful video. As I've noted in the chat, it's my first time seeing it as well. That's just incredible to work with you folks on that. Thank you. So I am hoping to, I know that you've had a long day already, and that you have had the good fortune to spend time with John Osorio and Willie Kauai, and I hope you've been able to eat some lunch. My hope is that I'm just not here talking at you. So to the best that I can, I'm going to try to create some type of dialogue between us. I have sort of a framework of different things that we can cover. I guess the first thing I'm interested in, maybe we can do this in the chat, is I'm curious as to what you are curious about in light of what we just watched together. What are you wondering about that was covered in the video, or perhaps there's something that was not covered in the video that you're interested or curious about? And even as things come up, as I'm gonna start to share some of the curricular work, because I know that you are all educators, I'm gonna start our talk story there, and just kind of give you an insight into some of the sort of, I guess, notes from the field of what the university is doing to help become more resonant to students' contexts, first of all, more relevant, and hopefully more resonant to their context. And I'll unpack those terms in just a little bit there. So I'm seeing that there's no questions yet from the video, so that's cool. As they come up, just feel free to chat them in there. Oh, here, great. We do have a sensing into the context of our environment and feedback loops. Yes, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. And what I'm hoping to do is to do a deeper dive into that framework of thinking, which is drawing upon the work of some of the great systems thinkers, great Western system thinkers of our times, namely Donella Meadows, who is no longer with us, but spent her life studying complex systems dynamics, and Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fries, who are still around today, picked up on that work and wrote a thought paper a few years back called Cultivating Emergence to Take Social Innovation to Scale. And I am in a formal thought partnership with a gentleman by the name of Sandy Wiggins, who helped develop some visuals that really helped to unpack this notion of emergence, and how we might be able to harness patterns that we see in natural systems and apply them to help us become more effective change agents in the social systems that we interact with and that we are entangled in. So Liz, I will do a deeper dive into that question maybe in the second half of the presentation. And maybe we can hold some of that language that I've introduced or that you might already be familiar with, and think about how it might apply to some of the things that I'm going to share here. Great, that's some super helpful context. So let's bear with me while I do a quick screen share. Don't judge my tabs when you see them. I'm told it's a sign of genius. That genius intelligence is correlated to the amount of tabs that you have open. How do I get rid of the thumbnails? Let's hide that. Beautiful. Okay, so this this story map, this infographic, we developed, gosh, almost 2 years ago now, to help us describe and unpack the current system-wide strategy that is in play to be able to infuse sustainability across curriculum. And let me actually use simpler language in that. Basically, how to help teachers more effectively and more affectively teach to the issues of our times. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just tell a story, and this visual will help me to unpack it. And I'll walk us through from left to right. And some important context to note here is my director of the Center for Sustainability Across Curriculum, Krista Heiser, who's a tenured faculty member at Kamakani Community College just down the road from me. She's a professor of composition and rhetoric, so she's an English teacher. She directs our Center for Sustainability Across Curriculum and has been working on sustainability education initiatives for the last 20 years now. And so a couple years ago, I managed to buy out some of her teaching time to come work with our office full time. And we embarked on a 2-year focus group study, seeking to try to understand and gain some insights as to what students know, think, do, and feel about climate change, sustainability, and resilience, and other related topics. So we talked to about 200 students across 7 campuses. We didn't quite get to all 10 University of Hawaii campuses. We were seeking to understand student perspectives in their early college experience, not pre-college, but sort of the first few years of their college experience. So undergraduates from across a broad spectrum. So we had, automotive students from our CTE programs to students that were specifically studying sustainability in sustainability programs, a really diverse mix. And these sort of 4 archetypes or profiles that you see on the left-hand side, this actually draws from earlier research from Krista's dissertation, where she was just trying to understand student perspectives on sustainability. And if I were to draw this in a sort of quadrant, you would see that your horizontal axis would be engagement. So low engagement to high engagement. And then your vertical axis would be sort of self-ascribed knowledge of sustainability. So if you're at the lower end of that axis, you self-identify as having a low knowledge level of sustainability versus self-identifying as having a high level. So imagine these on a quadrant. I couldn't render that in this poster here, obviously, but we'll start with this sort of first sort of archetype that emerged from Krista's earlier dissertation, and then was sort of emerged again. The pattern was still there in our 2-year focus group study. And these are, you've probably encountered some of these students. These are students that, like, they're part of their self-identity is we're sustainability leaders. And so, they carry their water bottle and they're, militant about not using plastic. Literally, some of them had like recycle tattoos. It's a very strong part of their sort of self-identity. These sustainability leaders, so they have a high self-ascribed knowledge base of sustainability, and their practices, their engagement, what the things that they do are also highly engaged. So they'd be in that top sort of right quadrant. I'm going to skip this cognitive dissonance when I'll come back to it. This cultural connections sort of archetype. These are students that they don't necessarily think of themselves as being knowledgeable about sustainability. However, their lived practices are very strong. So they might be engaged with gardening or hunting or fishing or something like that, or cultural practices. But if you're to ask them, oh, what do you know about sustainability? They'll probably say, not much. Haven't really thought about it. And I started with these two because we suspect, these two sort of archetypes, because we suspect that the overall number of students that sort of predominantly inhabit these kind of archetypes are probably the lower by number. The greater number of students probably inhabit these two, which are, to say, sort of low knowledge base level and sort of low lower knowledge base levels and lower engagement sort of levels. So on the bottom left and the top left of that quadrant, if you can hold that in your head. The cognitive dissonance, this is where students like, I know that I'm not supposed to be throwing this bottle, in the trash. But however, I can't afford $30 for a thermo flask, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. It's the only option I have. And there are many reasons for this cognitive dissonance where I know that I should be doing something different, but for whatever reason, I'm unable to. A lot of those reasons may have to do with socioeconomics and access. Some of those have to do just with sort of like emotional overwhelm of it. It's just too much to sort of sort through. It's too overwhelming. So I'm sort of stuck and I'm paralyzed. And then this other archetype of karmic retribution, we've since learned that there's now a sort of a term of art that's emerging with some literature around it. It's probably that is described as eco-nihilism. And this is a sort of state where it's like, well, it's just, we kind of have it coming to us. Nature's going to do what it's going to do. We kind of deserve this because we are treating the earth in such a poor way. And our 2 years worth of conversations, what emerged, actually, I'll pose this as a question to the group. So what do you folks think were some of the feelings that students sort of reported experiencing in and around climate change, sustainability, and resilience? Maybe what do you think is like the dominant sort of emotion that students are experiencing as they're trying to make sense in and around climate change? Go ahead and just put it in the chat there. Hopelessness, depression, overwhelmed. Yeah, what else? Anger. Yeah, these all certainly came up. Confusion, anxiety. Eco-anxiety is also a term of art now. There's quite a deal of emergent literature in and around eco-anxiety, climate grief, ecological grief. Yeah, nobody's put hope in here yet, notably. So some of the faculty members that we were sharing the results of our study back, so it's like, you guys needed to do a 2-year study to figure that out. And we're like, well, we kind of felt it. We just wanted to get some data around it. So yes, all of these are definitely emotions that students reported experiencing. We pulled from the behavioral sciences and utilized MaxQDA to code the transcriptions of the interviews that we did. So we were able to correlate certain utterances or certain phrases to specific core emotions. And the top emotions was worry. That's how we've termed it, although it would probably be more accurate to describe it almost as a despair, like a hopelessness. So there was worry, anger, fear, and shame. And those emotions outweighed the feelings of hope by a factor about 2 to 1. And interestingly, these aren't static sort of emotional states. Sometimes students would experience like flipping through the whole gamut of emotions in the course of a single day. So similar to that sort of lived experience of students that kept coming up as they were sharing, I feel all of the feelings at the same time sometimes, right? Similar to that experience that was relayed to us, these archetypes that are sort of illustrated on the left-hand side of the graphic, they're not static states. These describe states that you may be experiencing at any given time of day. We have certainly had some of our most ardent sustainability leaders crash hard and get into that cognitive dissonance or that eco-nihilism / climate retribution state after some type of event has triggered, be it a world event like the fires that are currently underway, or the Trump administration demolishing yet another environmental protection, or even something on campus. They tried to pass a motion to ban single-use plastic, and were told by an administrator that that's not possible at this time. Any number of these things can contribute to altering the emotional states of students. The title of this presentation, Higher Ed Must Teach to the Issues of Our Times to Remain Relevant, came from a presentation to the Board of Regents that I delivered last year. Every year we have to give an update to the board. And I didn't know if I was going to have a job after I finished giving that presentation. I will share a link in the chat here to a transcript of that, as I feel it might be useful. We unpack the study in a little bit more detail. And there's a few more resources that are given there. Where I'm going with this, and what I'd like to invite everyone to do now, is to think about these archetypes, these student archetypes. And I'm really curious to hear, like, do these resonate with you? Do you have students that, you know, you can see? I'm seeing folks shake their heads in the affirmative. Yeah, okay. So let's just go sort of from top to bottom. And as you're thinking about students that inhabit this sort of sustainability habitus, the sustainability leader type of archetype, what are the clues that tell you that that's where they're at? Are there specific behaviors? Are there specific topics of interest? Are there key phrases that they say? What are some of the clues to you that a student or a group of students are sort of inhabiting this kind of archetype? And the reason why I'm asking you this is because we feel it's really useful to understand where students are at, so that we can meet them where they're at when we begin our teaching, when we begin thinking about our teaching. Christina says the way they talk to each other. Can you say more about that? What are specific things that students who are sort of expressing the sustainability habitus, what are specific things that they say? And also, if anyone wants to unmute and chime in, please go ahead and do so.
I mean, they might tease each other for having a cup that's not recyclable instead of having their flask, for example. And just to hear them, the way they talk, and you'll hear someone say something about the fact of, like, yeah, this is what we're supposed to do. This is sustainable or environmentally friendly. And then you'll hear someone else make a remark that might sound more like the dissonance, right? Where, like, well, you know, this is too much. We can't do this. And then you'll hear other kids who will be like, well, you know, it's just going to cause the earth to go crash, and this is what we deserve. And it's just in the small things they kind of say within a conversation. They can say all those kind of remarks, right?
Yeah.
Easily.
It's kind of crazy, isn't it? Like, you just in these offhand conversations, they say, well, you know, talking about the end of the world sort of thing in their casual conversations. Yeah. Okay, so it's clear that everyone has like a clear idea of who might inhabit that.
And they might even say how useful plastics are. They might even say that in conversation. And this is what makes our life easier. Like, it's weird how they'll just say everything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's consistent with our experience for sure. For sure. And this experience is not just Chris and I. So we did a member check and went back to each campus and presented back to students who participated, and also faculty who are working directly with students. What about this, the straw reusable container? That's a big thing, isn't it? And social media, yeah, this generation is really huge on the social media component of it. And certainly not shy about declaring their beliefs. Yeah, great, this is great. Okay, so let's shift to the next archetype. Actually, I'm gonna skip the cognitive dissonance one. And so let's talk about cultural connections. What are the clues that tell you that a student sort of is inhabiting this archetype? What are the things that they do? What are the things that they might be talking about? what sort of behaviors or what sort of things might they be interested in? What sort of questions might they have? Anyone want to short circuit the chat and just jump in? And
I want to say like my kids give me gifts during like special times like makahiki or you know, and the gifts they give me is like a girl gave me a pickle of jars from cucumbers that she grew. A boy caught a fish and it was on my desk like a fish, and I was like, oh my god. And smoked it's the things that they give me because it's like my cat bringing cockroaches. I mean, not saying that that's like, but it's like, this is the best thing I have to offer you. And it's so cute. And I appreciate every single thing that they give me because we stress about making things and creating things and growing your own. And they appreciate the work and effort. So the way they show me thanks is by creating things for me and then giving it to me. So
that's I got chicken skin listening to that. Your students are amazing. Thank you. Do you go by Kale Lehua or is Kale okay? Thanks, Kale. That's such a beautiful story. Yeah, thank you. Christina's chiming in here as well. Christina, is this for cultural connections or for the previous one, sustainability habitus? I guess it could go either way. There's, yeah. It's interesting. I'm going to encourage you. I'll share this graphic if it's useful with Lisa, and if anyone's interested, you can access it afterwards. Students who want to work in the mala and sign up for gardening classes. Yeah, we found that it's a lot of like kinetic intelligence. You know, they're super intelligent and they're really interested in doing things. And what's interesting about these two groups, the sort of sustainability leaders and the cultural connections, is there's probably more shared values that they have, but the things that like drive each other crazy about each other are like the things that kind of sometimes prevent them from recognizing that underlying sort of shared values. And we've seen this is interesting when we share this with faculty. They're like, oh, I know faculty like this. This is helpful for for describing us, you know? That is certainly that dissonance that I was describing about faculty who sort of self-identify as like sustainability leaders and faculty that, you know, identify really strongly as like culturally connected and rooted and grounded. They often drive each other nuts, and it prevents them from recognizing the underlying shared values that they have. These are great comments here in the chat. Yeah, Kukia Imauna is a real obvious sort of indicator that that's a student who's expressing that sort of archetype or inhabiting that archetype. Great, this is great. Hunting versus veganism. Oh my gosh, I have had that conversation with a student employee of mine, and we had to in the end agree to disagree. And thankfully she still talks to me, so I think that's a good sign. Awesome, great. I'm glad the sort of the ideas are bubbling here and we're starting to recognize. So I'm going to move to the archetype just above this, cognitive dissonance archetype. So what are some clues that your students might be inhabiting this kind of archetype, this cognitive dissonance? In the speech bubble there in the graphic, that's one clue. That's definitely a phrase that we've heard versions of. Like, we know that global warming is coming, but what are they gonna do about it? You know, like how can I possibly, how could what I do possibly matter? You know, what else might be indicators of a student experiencing cognitive dissonance? And again, I'm going to invite anyone who feels called to unmute yourself and chime in.
I see more of that than the other two. And we live in Pune in a rural area, which It's kind of interesting that I feel like we see more of that with our students. They joke about the end of the world, and it's really strange because the way they do it is with kind of a wry, sarcastic sense of humor. But there's anger underneath it and sadness, I feel like. And I also see a lot of them just becoming completely paralyzed. They don't know what to do about the situation, and it seems really dire to them. And like you said, the word despair. I feel like there's more of those conversations and that those feelings that are coming from students than the first two,
Mm,
which, yeah.
thank you, Kimberly. Yeah, that's a really poignant share. That makes me think of one of the questions that we asked in the focus group protocol. And it was along the lines of like, when did you first become aware of climate change? Where did you learn about climate change? We asked that question. And actually, I'm gonna ask that to this group. Maybe you can just put in the chat here. Where do you think the number one source, what was the number one source that students sort of cited as to where they actually learned about climate change? Social media was, I want to say, 2 or 3 on the list. We described it as active media, media that's sort of pushed to you. Science class, faculty were listed dead last, as teachers were listed dead last. However, encouragingly, when teachers were listed as the source, we would hear this amazing story about this one teacher that they could say by name and how amazing they were in helping them, like speaking to these issues, you know. Parents, family, that was actually pretty low on the list as well. It was just right above teachers. It doesn't seem to be a lot of conversations. Like, it's not normal dinner conversation, right? Hey, let's sit around the dinner table and talk about climate change and the pending end of civilization as we know it. It's just sort of, we don't create spaces for those to happen. So it bubbles up in these side conversations. YouTube, we kind of had categorized in passive media, so media that you would have to go and look for, rather than media that's like being pushed to you on alerts on your phones and whatnot. News, viral videos with turtles and straws in their noses. Yeah, so these are all sort of like mimetic. Oh, sorry, so, Sarah mentioned Greta Thunberg earlier. Interestingly, when we did this focus groups, Greta hadn't sort of come to prominence yet. However, Leonardo DiCaprio had just released his climate change video before the flood. So a lot of folks listed Leonardo DiCaprio by name. It's like, this is one of the sources that I've learned about climate change. And it's similar with the turtles with the straw with their noses that kind of led the worldwide movement towards banning the straw. Kind of happened right after our focus group wrapped up. So the number one source, and these are from 20-something-year-old students, the number one source that was cited about where they learned about climate change is from their lived experience. So these are students that in their short lifetimes have said, I had a personal experience that I can directly connect the dots to climate change on. And it was, I mean, the stories we heard were amazing and heartbreaking and beautiful all at the same time, right? I was 8 years old and my grandma was crying, and I asked her why she was crying, and she said, because I can't feed you in the same way that I fed your mom, you know. Or I was, you know, 10 and or maybe not no specific age, but like the beach that we grew up sort of going to, spending time at as a family, it's not the same. It's not there anymore in the way that it was. And we just heard all these different examples of these kinds of really poignant stories. And at first, when it started bubbling up, we said, no, this can't be right. Surely this isn't accurate. And we kind of looked again, and this was in our midstream sort of point of the focus groups. And sure enough, the pattern kept repeating. The pattern kept repeating. which brings up a question that Krista and I really wanted to bring to this group, because I think it might help us all. We're trying to make sense of this. I know you folks are trying to make sense of all of this. We're curious to hear from your perspective in the grade levels that you are teaching. What do your students know today that they did not know 5 years ago? So I'm not meaning like the students that you have today versus the students you have 5 years ago, right? What do the group of students that you have today know? They just come in and they know it, right? From whatever, from their lived experience, from the world around them, from their interactions with family and social media and all of that. Is there anything new that they know that is like in their awareness that was not even on the radars of your students from 5 years ago? And if so, what was that? Thank you, Liz. Coral bleaching and acid ocean acidification. Lisa's, I have that same story with my auntie. Yeah, that, and we're close to the same age, so isn't that interesting? Polars are melting. A friend stopped scuba diving because it was too sad to watch the coral die. That is, wow, that is something we've also heard. Yeah. Yeah, does anyone want to unmute and chime in and share some thoughts on this question? Of course, this class, pandemics, yes. Rapid Ohia death. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll thank you. Thank you for responding to that question. It's constantly, the dads that I was talking about in the video, right? The only constant is change. As things continue to change, how do we continue to sense into what that context is so that we can continue to be relevant to our students? I'm going to shift down to this eco-nihilism or karmic retribution sort of archetype for a moment, and then we'll shift gears and I'll unpack the rest of this image so that we have some time left to talk about emergence. We may have already started to answer this in some of the earlier comments in the chat, where I was asking you what are some of the signals that are indicators of a student inhabiting this sort of cognitive dissonance space. And Kimberly chimed in with some really poignant sort of observations. Christina's saying your students are not plugged into the news, so find it interesting what they're aware of and what they are not. Yeah, that would be amazingly fascinating. Kimberly, as you were talking earlier about some of these casual conversations about the end of the world that your students are having, that's almost getting into the karmic retribution sort of eco-nihilism state. And I think what is useful here, there's a fine line of distinction between these lines, and it's easy to tip back and forth. And it seems like this cognitive dissonance seems to be like a dominant state, like a latent state, because our environment is signaling it all around us, right? I suspect that many of us walk around with this sort of general unease, this cognitive dissonance, because, you know, the world is obsessing about the latest insane tweet that's coming from our administration or whatever, you know, the case might be, whilst California and Oregon are literally burning, right, at unprecedented rates. And so we can start to feel like how you could slide, that's a pretty slippery slope. You could get into that eco-nihilist sort of place quite rapidly. And I'll just share a little personal story. I was there about this time last year. I went through a almost debilitating depression that really took me out. I had read David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth, which is a really difficult read. It's a sort of unflinching look at potential futures under various sort of climate collapse scenarios. And the premise of the book is David Wallace Wells, the IPCC reports and whatnot that come out, these are consensus documents. So the scientists are actually not saying they're not calling it how they actually see it, right? They've agreed, and so it's actually kind of numbed down a bit. So he dug into the actual reports underneath that, and as a journalist, and he said it was this like morbid fascination. The more he dug, the more he found this like like unfathomable apocalyptic sort of scenario playing out. And that's what he captures in the book. But we'll also say that the book is written very much from the dominant Western paradigm. You know, he has, as a cisgendered white male, he has a heck of a lot of privilege that shapes his perspective. And from that perspective that he carries, like, he is clearly a member of a dominant paradigm that is rapidly losing fitness to its context. And so this feeling of impending doom is very, very real for the dominant paradigm. That book was kind of the straw that broke my camel's sort of, you know, metaphoric back. And I was very fortunate in that I have a very strong support network professionally. My colleagues, my office manager, and I have worked together for almost 20 years, if you can believe that. My family and my home environment is really, really supportive and have had their own journeys in dealing with anxiety and depression and whatnot. So I was surrounded by folks who had it in their lived experience to develop tools to help move me through that. And that developed for me personally, but also for my closest colleagues, a fitness to this context, right? That there's so much mental health issues that folks are dealing with right now with all the pressures and stressors of this COVID reality. And so we had this mini pressure cooker that we went through last year that now we find ourselves uniquely equipped to be able to support others who are moving through this. And I'm using that language specifically because you've probably heard of the stages of grief, right? Denial, bargaining, forget the other two, and then it finishes up at resolution. Chris and I were talking this morning, and we had this thought bubbled up, like, what if we were to reconceptualize that as like seasons, and not seasons of grief, but seasons of, say, resolution. So resolution, which is where I have arrived at on the other side of that deep depression triggered by my own ecological grief and anxiety, has lent me with a really sober optimism, and a sense of what is truly important, and also a sense of our limits, and a really pragmatic sense of, well, how then shall we live? If this is the unfolding realities, where then shall we best focus? Where would we in our communities that we serve, where should we focus our attention for the maximum sort of impact and positive results? So we've even noticed that the rhetoric that we use, the language that we use, we used to be all around fighting climate change and empowering students to fight climate change. And when you unpack the root causes of climate change, you know, it's often sort of said, well, greenhouse gas emissions are the root cause of climate change. And there is a causal relationship to that, yes. If we're thinking about it in sort of biogeochemical terms, then that is an accurate statement. However, what is causing society to produce these excess emissions, right? And so if we unpack that further, well, it's capitalism. Well, there is a lot of truth to that, especially the particular brand of global extractive consumer culture driven capitalism, which creates really strong incentive landscapes for things like mountaintop removal and deforestation and these types of things, erasure and genocide of entire peoples. What's under that? How could we possibly behave that way towards another human or towards our non-human relatives, if we were not entangled, or if the dominant paradigm were not entangled in a perspective that sees themselves as separate and apart from the natural world, rather than in kinship, in relationship with, right? And so many of us modern humans are severed from those intimate connections that our ancestors once had with specific places. For those of us who are settlers in Hawaii, this might be especially poignant for us because it's often termed the Aloha Spirit, right? Oh, it's Hawaii's so special, it's the Aloha Spirit. I think there's something that's been really healing for me to be in relationship with Hawaiians who are actively working to protect and nourish and cultivate the connections to those ancestral knowledge systems that I have been severed from. I'm a child of a long line of people in displacement from the islands of the Philippines and from the islands of Ireland, from the islands of Scotland. And me, through my actions and being in relationship with Hawaiians and being in relationship with Aina, has helped facilitate my healing and has helped me to reconnect to those distant ancestral, indigenous ancestral knowledge systems and ways of being that I once was, that I am descended from, but have lost my way from. And I don't mean to be too sort of metaphysical and psychedelic here, but it's literally like transcending space and time and helping me to heal these intergenerational traumas that I and so many of us carry, often unconsciously, right? So boy, I've gone really far away from unpacking the rest of this graphic. I feel that I've learned to trust where we're called to go in our conversation. So that felt particularly needed. And I've done a fair bit more writing on this. I'll be sure to drop, not a fair bit, I've done a little bit of writing on this on my bloggy blog. Thank you, Nicole. I share that because I know that others are going through this. Yeah. And it is not, these are very necessary conversations. If we are not even speaking about these, then how could we expect to move through these, right? And that has become a primary and explicit focus of Krista's work at the Center for Sustainability Across Curriculum. We draw a lot from Joanna Macy's work, the work that reconnects. A lot of my personal time is spent working with folks like the Native Hawaiian Place of Learning Advancement Office at UH Manoa. We've been working behind the scenes to establish an Office of Indigenous Innovation in the Vice President of Research and Innovations Office, and with groups like Purple Maya and the Purple Prize. I guess what I want to, I feel might be useful to kind of wrap up that rabbit hole that we just went into is we have learned that for us to be able to affectively and effectively teach to these issues of our times that we ourselves are like, struggling to keep up with, there's work that we have to do to bring ourselves through to this place of resolution. And then from that sober, like, it's almost like a stripped out sort of perspective, right? Of how then shall we live? What is truly important? Where shall we focus our time? How shall I show up in the best ways for this generation so that they can be equipped to navigate the massive amounts of uncertainty that they are the heirs to? That is something that we have developed, we have felt is really needed by our faculty. And so I'm going to click over real quick to show you, there's the transcript that I will share. This is Krista's field notes blog. And if I can navigate through these Zoom notes, I'll just drop this in the chat here. These we did a 2-year student focus group study, currently underway on a similar faculty focus group studies so that we can better understand how to prepare and equip faculty. So these are, I think there's about 20 conversations. Our IRB protocol has us interviewing up to 100 faculty. And if any of you are interested and would like to participate in this, please let me know. We would be really grateful and honored to be able to do this. It's about a 1-hour interview process. There are some fascinating insights from faculty who are developing or navigating through this in real time. And so you're literally hearing sort of lessons and perspectives from the field of what's working, what's not working, what we're struggling through. And there's some really interesting patterns that have emerged. One of our favorite faculty members, gosh, sorry, we keep the names confidential, so we use aliases in these field notes. But she talks about, man, I was doing this all wrong. I was just totally bumming my students out. I was telling them how messed up things are, and I didn't know. I thought I was teaching to the issues, and yeah, she was teaching to the problems, right? But if we're not careful in how we do that, it can be really disempowering. We can flip our students into this eco-nihilism really, really quickly. Case in point, this is a screen or graphic from an online survey we administered during Earth Day last year to Manoa. Key takeaway, 95% students are concerned, or very concerned about climate change. And look how it breaks down amongst the specific colleges and where the professional colleges are at. So students in professional colleges are indicating that they are less likely to be very concerned. Now, is that because our professional schools are teaching them to be so well equipped that they feel confident that we're going to be able to overcome this? I don't know. I suspect not. Let me put it that way. And what are the implications of this? What are the implications of students expressing this level of concern and then us not being explicit about how we're addressing this in the classroom? It is not an ethnographic study. We do have those demographics because they're tied to the student IDs. So we can actually slice through this and take a look at those different perspectives. Our IRO office develops a really robust tool to help faculty like you to be able to dive into these findings and start to unpack that. This is more of our philosophy of like, how can we be useful to our frontline teachers? You folks are, you matter so crucially to the schools that you serve at because you're the ones that are spending time with the students. So how do we best help our students? Let's support our faculty. Well, how are we going to do that unless we know what's actually going on in your world, right? So I'll come back here and I don't want to leave this hanging. So I'm going to unpack the rest of this. I think I can do that pretty rapidly. And just share that, hide sidebar, there we go. Okay, so what you're seeing here in these bubbles, these are, so we know that students are concerned and we know that it's hit or miss if they get it in the classroom, right? Dead last, faculty were dead last as to where they reported learning about climate change, sustainability, and resilience, but it's there. It's embedded across our general education, but the processes, we don't make it very visible for students. So if they're looking for it, they'll find it, but if they're not looking for it explicitly, it's hit or miss. And so to begin to address that and help develop some type of coherence for students to be able to learn about these issues from different disciplinary perspectives, we developed a marker, sustainability focus marker, which is like a banner code. So you can go and you can look and you can find sustainability focus courses. There's a coherence to these courses. They are all teaching to one or more core concepts of sustainability. And these are core concepts that continue to evolve. These are developed by faculty in the campus sustainability curriculum committees. And we facilitate a cross-campus dialogue via the system-wide sustainability curriculum coordination council that meets every semester. And we say, are these still relevant? Are these still resonant? Do they need to be updated? Do some need to go? Do they need to evolve? How, right? So earlier, who was asking about when I was talking about feedback loops, this is one of the ways that we maintain a tighter feedback loop. We're constantly asking, does this make sense? Is this still relevant? Does it still resonant? Does it need to be something different? Does it need to grow? Does it need to evolve? And faculty themselves sort of vet these courses. So faculty will bring a course, say, I'm teaching, you know, geography or botany or chemistry, but and in my chemistry class, I'm teaching about ecological footprint or climate change or whatever it is. And then their council of faculty will say, well, how are you doing this? What type of pedagogies are you utilizing? And we are literally connecting people to each other so that they can respond, right, in real time, sensing to the context that they're in. And this process has yielded this indicator code, which has allowed us to develop now a first-year sustainability minor that is currently offered at 5 community college campuses. The University of Hawaii also offers, it's the wrong, we also offer 5 bachelor's level programs that are sustainability focused. Note that I use that word focus. That means that there's a primary and explicit focus on the hallmark, the key hallmark of sustainability, and that is systems and systems thinking. And so now students we're beginning to articulate those pathways up. And so these are, I'll drop this link as well in the chat, and the folks can investigate these more. A lot of resources here that might be helpful. And now this is how, this sort of describes a current state of play regarding establishing a coherence around sustainability education at the University of Hawaii. This is all designed to be in the first year of a student experience for a number of reasons. One, we're high in the watershed, right? That has a potential to shape and frame whatever their future academic or non-academic pathways might be. We want to get this information to them in a coherent manner early on and develop some type of sustainability literacy and start to build the frameworks for sustainability competencies, by which I mean thinking in systems, thinking strategically, thinking futures thinking, values-based thinking, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to collaborate radically, you know, and forge unlikely partnerships and sit with dissonances and resonances. And finally, to wrap up this graphic, this green dot here describes a second intervention that we've been developing. It's still in a pilot phase because we haven't been able to get the funding that we need to do this. But one of the massive insights that we had from the student focus group study was that, oh my gosh, it is possible for a student to graduate from the University of Hawaii having not been formally introduced to climate change and the science of climate change and what the science tells us about how it is likely to impact their futures, let alone taking conscious, coherent steps to equip them with the necessary tools, skills, experiences, relationships, networks to successfully navigate those. So this green dot represents we call it a SMOOC, a small, massive, open online course. It's a asynchronous online learning module, not for credit, that has 4 specific modules. We've only developed 2. The first module around understanding climate change is the Chip Fletcher Doom Lecture. So you don't have to go and figure out how to talk about and explain climate change. You can just plug Chip Fletcher in and he can scare the bejesus out of them. And then you can meet them in the class and catch them, right? And begin to like move them through the different emotions that come up in dealing with the scale and magnitude of these challenges. And the other module that we have been able to build out is this utilize core concepts and key terms in sustainability. So this is about equipping them or strengthening that sustainability literacy that is being addressed in the first year academic subject certificate. Now, here's something really promising. Kapiolani Community College, after years of the General Education Committee saying, nope, sustainability is not a thing, it's not a thing, it's not important, but what do we got to teach about that for? Now all of a sudden the general ed committee is saying, shouldn't sustainability be a requirement? And so we have quite literally created conditions for that type of a transformation to occur, right? This was not in place 5 years ago. All of what I've laid out is an emergent response to us sensing into our context, trying to understand our students' world, trying to understand our faculty's world, so that we could then develop really specific responses to help meet those needs. And in doing so, now 5 years later, all of a sudden we have 5 campuses that have a sustainability minor, and we have a gen ed committee that is saying, shouldn't this be required? So it's not a fight anymore. We don't have to state our case and, you know, enter into that war of ideas. Instead, what we are focuses on is creating conditions for that type of a transformation to occur. And that's all, that's a heck of a lot of information that was encoded in this one poster. I just want to address a couple of comments here, and then I'm cognizant of our time, so I'm gonna have a question back for Lisa, our moderator, to make sure that your folks' flow is kept intact. So Liz says, sustainability graduates are more likely to create their own career path, job, or slip into a pre-existing career. This is a really interesting question. Few years back, I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with the state of Hawaii's sustainability dashboard or Aloha Plus dashboard. I was involved as the co-chair for that process. It was an imperfect process. It was a great attempt, and it exists, and it's been a catalyst for a bunch of other information. Won't get into the details on it. It's not necessarily relevant to this conversation, except that to say that one of the indicators on the dashboard that they wanted to measure progress on was green jobs in education. And so the question that was asked us was, well, what are green jobs, right? So it's clean energy, it's conservation, and what else? And our response was, I'm not sure that's actually the right question. But there's all this talk right now about how this pause in tourism, this COVID disruption is an opportunity for us to reimagine our economy, right? To reinvent, because all of this rhetoric. Well, it's our humble opinion, our small core team of catalysts, that the best shot that we have of transforming our economy is transforming our education. And it's not necessarily about preparing students to participate in green jobs. It's about what competencies are we equipping our students with to navigate uncertain futures. It's about how do we infuse sustainability literacy across all jobs? How do we ensure that our MBAs are graduating with a grounding in ecological principles? If we're not doing that, we're creating more, our most harmful emission may be our students. We're creating more people that are skilled and highly competent in completely the wrong things. They're skilled and highly competent in advancing the very systems that are literally causing us to consume our resource base. So if I'm to distill that in a principle, the key wondering would be, are we asking the right questions? Are there better questions we could be asking ourselves and our students? Justin says, Chip does a great job sounding alarm climate change. He does. We developed this SMOOC, pale green dot, of an online course, intended to eventually be like an open educational resource. So if any of you have hawaii.edu email addresses, it's quite easy for me to give you access to Lalima and to that site. If any of you are interested in accessing that and don't have hawaii.edu email addresses, please reach out and contact me anyway. This would be a wonderful challenge for us to nut out and figure out how we can get more people access to this content. Christina, the opportunity to make changes so great at this. Yes. Yes, that's a very good, yes, very really poignant observation. I told that how can we make sure we do the changes we need? That would be the emergence part of this presentation. But I told Lisa I'd wrap at 2:30. So I want to check back with you, Lisa, and just do a quick time check here.
You still had an hour and 30 minutes, and you started at around 1:20. What time is it now? It's 2:28. So you got another 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, 2:50. Thank you, Christina. Perfect. We got this. Great. Khaled, thank you for your email. I will be sure to save this chat. Let me just make sure that I can save this chat. Yes, I can. Great. Yeah, so if anyone else wants to private message me with your email address, and I can add you to our lists and whatnot. All right, so emergence, which is one of the first questions that came up. And let me see if I can do another screen share here. Great. There it is, screen share. Thanks, folks. I'm seeing the email addresses come in. That's really great. I'll be sure to save the chat. Lisa, your team might want to save the chat as well in case I mess that up somehow. we can back each other up. All right, so I'm gonna do my best. I should be able to get through this in 10 minutes, so we have at least 10 minutes of time for some more questions at the end. This presentation was shared with me by Sandy Wiggins. Sandy's one of the co-founders of USGBC. They're the folks that developed like the LEED certified sort of frameworks and whatnot. It's actually not Sandy's proudest achievement. He kind of, in safe circles, he will share how that is a great example of how not to start a movement, because the whole USGBC initiative emerged as a result of sort of what the building and design community was sensing into their frustrations of wanting to build more environmentally sort of friendly and compatible buildings. So Sandy now, he's based in DC. He spends his time working with executive boards for philanthropic organizations to shift how they think of and allocate capital away from this like protect and preserve the endowment that continues to invest in fossil fuel industries and whatnot and just spend the sort of dividends, to this sort of transformative approach of like, okay, it's real now. Like this is potentially the last quarter of the game for our species, and we need you. So how do we deploy it? How do we radically deploy this capital? And I mentioned Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fries, that I have a one-pager of resources that I share with the Harvard group that I'll happily share with you folks. It's for further readings on emergence, and the meeting of wisdoms between indigenous knowledge systems and Western empirical sciences, and on transition. Transition being a way to talk about acknowledging that humanity is moving, that the human species is moving towards, if we're not already in, a sort of evolutionary knothole, as it were. So this places to intervene in a system, this comes from Donella Meadows' work, who spent her lifetime studying complex systems, complexity science. She's one of the sort of like founder or mothers of Western complexity science. And so you see the numbers go from top to bottom, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So at the top of this list is where we most often intervene with a system to try to enact change, right? You often see like, oh yeah, let's do a new subsidy or tax or whatnot. And all the way on the bottom, number 1 is the most impactful place to intervene in a system, yet it is the least place that we intervene least often. So that's how to make sense of this. I'm not going to go through every single point on this. I'll happy to also share this presentation, and you're welcome to go look into it further. I'll just point to here. So you've probably heard of the Global Sustainable Development Goals, right? That were ratified Paris Accords back in 2015. Those are a set of targets, goals, and metrics that countries are. Donald Trump famously removed the United States from the Paris Agreement, which was the global agreement, 195 nations, to set targets for sustainable development, for sustainable existence. So that is an intervention that is still not the most impactful place to intervene for systems change. It is a very potentially impactful place too. It's number two. But the number one place to intervene, the key takeaway from this, is on the mindset or paradigm out of which the goals, rules, and feedback structure arise. A good friend of mine, Darren Doherty, is a regenerative agriculture specialist based in Australia. He says that the hardest climate to change is the climate of the mind. The 6 inches of gray matter between our ears, the hardest climate to change. We can change the global climate, but try to change this climate, good luck, right? It's very, very Aussie. I love Darren. And this is a quote from one of my favorite authors, author of The Little Prince. I'm not going to attempt to say his name because I'll butcher it. But this reminds me, this evokes Nainoa Thompson, talking about not the how we're going to sail, but the why, right? We humans are so wired for stories. Stories is the deep code of our algorithm. Stories help to access deep archetypes, deep knowledge. The deep code of our common human ancestry is embedded in stories and storytelling. That's related to the question I asked earlier, or can we ask a better question, right? Because questions lead to stories. Questions can lead to new stories. So that's framing context for what I'm about to share. This describes what happens when an old system goes into decline and a new system begins to emerge. So you can think about this in terms of, say, an ecosystem. Let's think about this in terms of an organism, a living organism in an environment that is shifting, right? What happens is evolutionary pressures start to accelerate the rate of mutation. These mutations are experiments, they're innovations that are arising in response to changing conditions. They are emerging in response to the changing environment. Yeah, that describes what happens in ecological systems. You can think of when a nearshore ecosystem flips from sort of micro or macroalgae dominant to microalgal, where you have like these toxic algal blooms, right? There's a threshold that's crossed, and then all of a sudden the paradigm is radically different. Sometimes you can wind that back. Sometimes you cross the threshold and the paradigm can't be wound back. Hold that in your mind. Now let's think about this in terms of social systems. So think about this in terms of maybe an organization that you are aware of that has gone into decline, or maybe organizations that we are observing in real time going into decline. I'll leave it to your imagination as to what might fit that description. I tend to think of this as the dominant global paradigm, the dominant form of quote unquote culture of society, this Western dominant culture, dominant consumer culture of global extractive capitalism. That is an old system that is rapidly losing fitness to its context. And we are seeing all these really fascinating trailblazers emerge in response to those changing conditions. And as those trailblazers begin to start to recognize each other, something interesting starts to happen. The new system can begin to emerge from that. And there are some really fascinating roles that start to show up. Now, protectors, this might not be the best way to describe this role, so I'll describe it functionally, and then we might be able to think of other words that would make sense. Actually, I think he actually does make it is a really wonderful potential way to think about this. These are folks who are embedded in the institutions of the old system. They have access to either influence or to resources somehow, be that social capital or whatever that, however they have sort of amassed that. And these are interesting characters because they recognize the value in this emergent trailblazers. They recognize that that is valuable, which means that they also recognize that something is not right with the current paradigm, right? And the key role that they play is they're able to start to funnel resources from the old paradigm, from the old system to this emergent system, to be able to nourish these emergent trailblazers. We also have this other role, key role, of the illuminators. These are the storytellers. These are the folks who have the gift of telling that compelling story, of describing the island that's over the horizon, of tapping into that deep code of the human algorithm, into the mythopoetic sort of algorithms that stir our hearts to action and compel us to move. There are storytellers, our illuminators. These are not sort of similar to when I threw up the archetypes earlier. These aren't static states. These are states that are useful for us to name because we might be called to play different roles at different times. So as I'm describing these, maybe think about people that you might know that might fit one of these roles in your world. Also, maybe think about how you may fit one or more of these roles in the different contexts that you interact with. There's a fluidity to this. That storytelling function, the illuminators, each of those trailblazers carries that as well, because each of those trailblazers they have the story of their individual response to the changing conditions, right? So individually, they're telling a piece of that new system that is emerging. And as a collective, they are all telling a broader, more nuanced story of this emergent system. We can start to see why it's so important to connect these innovators, these bright spots, to each other. You guys are all bright spots. The function of this meeting, like today's session, to connect you folks so that you can collectively make sense, right? So you can share information, knowledge, resources with each other. This is emergence in real time. This next role, hospice workers, was really interesting for me. It took me a while to make sense of this, because my first response was like, oh my God, I work for the University of Hawaii. Am I a hospice worker? Is that what I'm called to do? Am I supposed to hospice this place? What does that even mean? In the world of aid and development, for example, there are a lot of NGOs whose work is relief, right? Their work is not to go create conditions to enact systems change. Their work is to lessen human suffering and to protect human dignity. And that is a hugely important role, because they're literally protecting what makes us most human, right? And so, yes, there are times where I have to play that role. That is an especially useful role for me to be able to name and think about when I find myself encountering individuals or groups who are either unable or unwilling to change in response to the changing context. Oh, maybe my role is just to hospice these folks, you know? It gives me access to more options as to how to interact. The whole theory of change is one of the reasons why I really love this theory of change, is that it's quite simple. I thought I had better graphics for this. There are 4 key activities that we need to pay attention to. If we name these innovations and connect them to each other and nourish them, what happens? They can better begin to illuminate and call forth this emergent system, the new system that is arising. I've been really excited to share this presentation with folks who are interested in increasing their agency to be able to interact with complex systems and to be able to increase their ability to work towards transformation. I think one of the reasons it resonates for me is because it's so aligned with natural processes. This describes change in nature doesn't happen as a result of a 5-year strategic plan, right? Change in nature is this constant dance of emergence, it's this weird tension of seeming opposites that we as humans are massively shaped by our context. More so, we think that we have a lot more free will than we actually do. What we fail consistently to recognize is how much our socio-cultural context shapes our decision-making, right? So we're massively influenced by our context. And what we also forget to realize is that we we absolutely matter. We have the ability to shift that sociocultural context. It's a fractal. In the body, in our own bodies, right? The lungs don't compete with the heart, because if they did, they know that they're both goners. In our own body, the health of the cell is directly related to the health of the organ, which is directly related to the health of the body, right? Which is directly related to the health of the mind, which is directly related to our emotions, which is directly related to our family, community, right? It's this fractal. Christina asked, would I compare the story of people like Lincoln and inheritance with change? Ooh, that's a juicy question. I think that theories of change and frameworks for transformation are useful to the extent that they allow us to deepen our practice. So I think it might be useful to think about those individuals and think about, like, how do they fit in, or how does this framework sort of fit in with what I know of their context? I also feel like it's perhaps they displayed an unconscious competence at cultivating emergence. They were really good at what they did, but they didn't know that it wasn't explicit in their minds that they were doing this thing to enact this, right? And I think that's something wonderful about naming, is you make the unknown known, you make the implicit explicit. And if we can start to describe the things that we are doing, we can start to be more precise about how we're doing it. We can start to sense into what we are doing collectively. We can give and take and seek feedback so that we can develop more precision around these tools, and we can then build a community practice around it. I saw somebody ask if I can share my email. So I will do that. And well, look at that. 5 minutes left on the clock. So I will, I guess, open the floor in the last 5 minutes to either the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute and chime in with any questions or comments or wonderings that you feel might be helpful for the group to digest and metabolize this information.
Matt, it's Lise. I think what's really interesting is probably a lot of people who don't know you like the way I do. They probably think you've been doing this your whole life. So maybe if no one has any other questions, like serious questions, I think if you share like what happened and how you got to where you were, you know, that year you took off of, kind of dropped out.
Yes, yeah, Lisa and I go way back. So thanks for being gentle with that, Lisa. The best way to answer that, so first, here's the link to the presentation I gave to the Board of Regents last year that I didn't know if I would still have a job. And to answer your question, Lisa, the title of this presentation that I'm going to drop a link to here kind of tells it all. And I will, I gave this talk 10 years ago, but if you're interested, you can do it. I was a hardcore capitalist, so a lot of the work I do now is to restore my karmic balance for the excesses I contributed to. Let's just put it that way. Christina asks, how can you teach resilience from a place of strength? That is really the core of a lot of Krista's work with faculty professional development. I wish she were here. She could speak to that far more powerfully through her lived experience. I think what I can share on that might be useful to the group is that a lot of these teaching resilience or even healing, right? You can't really teach healing. It's something that is almost modeled and conveyed, you know? I mean, you can teach healing modalities, but you can't teach a person to heal. Ultimately, the person has to actually do the healing themselves, right? And I think that for resilience especially, that is something that is like, so there's these best-selling books around grit and stuff like that right now, right? And the power of vulnerability and all of this kinds of stuff. And ultimately what that's getting to, how I understand that, is healing. The most resilient among us have had to go through some type of gauntlet to develop tools to be able to deal with all of that crap. I have tools now, my team has tools now to help people move through eco-anxiety and climate grief and these things because we have a lived experience of having to do it. My team, if I had not been able to continue to show up for my team in the way that they needed me to, and the way that the folks that depend on us needed me to, right? The consequences would have been severe and significant and impacted a large number of people. So the stakes were high. So I feel really strongly that in order to teach affectively and effectively to the issues of our times and to equip our students with the things that they are going to need, like resilience being one of the key things that they are going to need, we actually have to be moving through these spaces ourselves. And so I guess in closing, what I would ask from this group is, what are things that you folks need? What are things that, for example, the University of Hawaii could do better or could provide to help you folks be more effective in your callings, in your professions, in your teaching? I didn't realize that would be such a cliffhanger of a question. What I might do then, so that we don't have to sit in an awkward silence together.
Wait a minute. Yeah. Ian has a question for you. Does your program have plans to expand the Albizia Tech and share with schools like ours?
So Albizia Tech, let me, Ian, unmute and just ask me yourself if this answer is inadequate. We love hosting school groups there and giving talk stories. I gave a talk to some mid-pack students earlier this week. Between myself and Joey, he's the actual architect of it. I'm like the social architect. I held back the bureaucracy long enough for that thing to get built. But Joey's the design genius. So we can talk about that structure in different ways. I tend to talk about how it is like opening up potentially a whole new regenerative forestry sector because I'm systems obsessed, and that's just how I think. Joey can break down as an architect what design process he went through. So we can absolutely, like, we are like an open book there and love to share and encourage and work with our youth to be able to encourage more of that. The specific sort of milling and CNC technologies and all of that, these aren't proprietary things. These are, we're just organizing them in different ways, right, to create the structures. Yeah, oh, let me drop that link in there too.
Have you connected some of our woodshop courses and teachers in the high school with some of the stuff you're doing with the Albizia at the university to kind of connect it and use the trees with our students to do projects that were younger students?
Yeah, so there's a, I think we're gonna do this again this year. Last year we did with the Hawaii Wood Show, we had a student competition as well. So that's through Steve Hill at the School of Architecture's Wood Shop, who has been working with the Hawaii Wood Show for years, and they have their networks. But Joey and I don't have those direct networks intact. That's been the primary sort of mechanism for us to be able to outreach to younger students. And I guess we'd be open to like learning how to do more of that. Yeah, might be a for the conversation. Thea?
Yes, yeah, thanks. Just in thinking about your question about what, what do we as educators need? And what popped into my head is, because I know there's networking, I know there's partnerships that happen to a degree between UH and then the high schools and elementary schools, but just thinking about like having more programs or any programs, because I can't really think of any that really link university students to I teach high school, so I'm thinking high school in my head, but even to elementary school students, like at our charter school, we have this senior project, and the students spend an entire year, they find a project or a topic that they're passionate about, they design it's very embedded, like research and then a project and a presentation. Anyway, we always kind of struggle at the school trying to hook our students up with mentors out in the community. And I was thinking like these mentorships would be so powerful if they were coming from UH students or students at HCC. I'm on the Big Island. So, like that would be such a pull and so inspirational, because I'm old already. I can talk and I can try to inspire them, but it's not the same as when it comes from their peer, and there's so much, those generations they think they're far apart, but they're so close together and their lived experience is so similar that I just feel like there'd be so much inspiration that could be drawn, from the UH students with the Haumana at the high school and elementary school.
Did you say you're on Kauai?
No, on Hawaii.
Hawaii Island.
Puna.
Okay, got it. Yeah, thank you. You've like confirmed something that this has been a wondering of Krista and mine too. Like, how can we help our high school students see themselves on the campus because they have relationships there? And we do that well in these pockets, but not as an institution. So I hear you affirming some of the things that we've been sensing, and it kind of, thank you. I'm going to take that and think about more how we can do a better job of that sort of institutionally. I will also say it takes time, so bear with us, but I've heard, and yes, we'll incorporate that.
I mean, Matt, it's Lisa. I think that if you mandate it, how to graduate from the University of Hawaii in undergrad or even grad school, you have to get certain amount of credits and fulfill certain amount of required courses. So this is really far-fetched because it probably won't fly with admin, but it'd be great if we mandated you had to do service work for 1 year before you graduated, like 2 semesters of service work. And that could be supporting a high school with mentorship in order to graduate from college. But I'm sure that won't fly.
Well, so there was a proposal that was just put forward by a group from the President's Emerging Leaderships Program, which is sort of like, it's a professional development. A lot of our existing administrators have gone through that UH program and then, risen into leadership positions. And the proposal was along the lines of a requirement for all students to provide X amount of service hours as a graduation requirement. And concurrently, one of Manoa's service learning office is piloting this semester a mechanism to be able to track that centrally, because it happens in pockets, but not able to report that out. And that's it's a very similar playbook to with the sustainability focused courses. We just started counting courses, and then we had to do that. We needed to have the process and the criteria, and then it had the rigor, and it was these sort of cascading effects. So we are actually starting on counting service hours with that directly in mind, but I hadn't connected that service hour requirement that is in play, or emerging rather, with connecting it to like mentorship opportunities. So this is a really great example, folks, of like emergent. Like there's always some key piece of information that I get if if I'm not just talking at people, if I'm asking questions, that we can then carry forth and use to like increase our sensory capacity as our strategy continues to emerge and reveal itself. So thank you. That's really, really valuable. And I'm seeing in the chat here too, some like confirmation around that. So I'm over time. Lisa, I'll turn it back to you. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to spend time with all of you. And I just really want to mahalo and acknowledge all of you for keeping it together and for showing up in all the awesome ways that you do for our youth. Just so grateful and humbled to be with you all today. Mahalo.
Mahalo nui loa, Matt. Thank you. We got a lot out of your presentation. Okay, so we're gonna take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back with Kaipo Tam.